How many times have you heard your relatives talk about their Native American ancestors?
Do you know any relatives that are members of a Native American nation?
Do you know any black people who are official members of a tribe?
Do you know why?
There has been a movement in recent years among African Americans to recover this lost Native American ancestry. However, it has been met with some resistance. In fact, in September 2023, 2 black descendants of freedmen sued the Creek Nation for denying their applications.
So why was this legal battle even necessary in the first place?
After all, the United States extended citizenship to the former slaves following emancipation.
So why would indigenous nations who owned slaves and subsequently freed them after the Civil War not do the same?
And what about those freed slaves who had indigenous blood?
The answer lies somewhere in the tangled history of the United States and its problems surrounding race and identity. It's probably safe to say that it started with the one-drop rule, which was a formal set of state codified laws that came about in the early 20th century as sort of a racial classification system that basically asserts that any person with even one drop of black blood is considered black. This concept has roots in the 19th century American South, where it was used to maintain racial segregation and uphold white supremacy.
It was based on a non-scientific system of racial classification. It asserted that any person with even one ancestor of African ancestry or one drop of black blood is considered black. It's an example of Hypodescent, the automatic assignment of children of a mixed union between different ethnic groups to the group with the lower status, regardless of proportion of ancestry in different groups.
The one-drop rule contributed to the creation of a racially stratified society where social and legal implications of race dictated one's status and treatment under the law.
In the framework of colonial enslavement, physical traits associated with Africans, such as dark skin, broad noses, and tightly curled hair, were blatant symbols of inferiority.
These characteristics instantly conveyed one's standing within the hierarchy of power, determining one's status as free or enslaved. Whiteness signified freedom and bestowed specific rights, while blackness denoted enslavement and a status perceived as subhuman.
Nevertheless, the distinction between blackness and whiteness began to erode due to widespread racial intermixing. Despite its prevalence, such mixing was openly condemned from the outset. However, the reality often starkly contrasted with the public perception.
As early as 1630, examples of societal disapproval for interracial relationships emerged, including the case of colonist Hugh Davis, who was punished with the public whipping for his actions which were deemed blasphemous and disgraceful.
Whites were deeply concerned about racial mixing, particularly because at that time, they were outnumbered by the black population. Many harbored fears and dread of a black takeover. Beneath their physical apprehensions lay deeper psychological fears.
Basically, to uphold white supremacy, the concept of whiteness had to be viewed as pure.
The anxieties surrounding racial mixing among whites were anchored in eugenics and scientific racism, which posited that the white race was superior and that physical and mental characteristics were inherited. Consequently, it was believed that racial intermingling diminished human quality and further jeopardized the existence of the white race. Within this paradigm, blackness was seen as a contaminant capable of corrupting and severely compromising an entire gene pool.
This resulted in the one-drop rule becoming essential for preserving the white gene pool, thereby maintaining the stronghold of power for whites.
A clear delineation between who was white and who was not became essential to preserving their dominance. Hence the creation of a racial hierarchy.
In order for this hierarchy to work, it had to extend beyond social measures. It demanded legal measures, which led to the establishment of anti-miscegenation laws.
These laws criminalize marriage and carnal relationships between different races. Black individuals were already enslaved, so these statutes aimed to regulate the conduct of white folks.
Interracial marriage was forbidden, and those who engaged in interracial relationships faced severe penalties, including heavy fines, public ridicule, and even banishment from the community. Officiants who performed marriages for mixed couples could be ousted from their occupation, publicly flogged, and in some cases, hanged. If a white woman had a carnal relationship with a black man and gave birth to a child, she faced the possibility of becoming enslaved herself. This was done to ensure that mixed-race children always inherited the status of the mother.
The notion that children born to enslaved mothers would inherit the mother's status marked a significant departure from traditional English common law, which established that children took on the status of their fathers. However, laws were often altered to uphold white supremacy. In effect, if a white man fathered a child with a black woman, he faced no legal obligation to support or acknowledge that child.
Ultimately, if the child's mother was his property, he acquired not only a child, but extra property, as well as an additional source of labor and income. Consequently, the law unwittingly allowed for the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, as indeed on some plantations, certain enslaved women were specifically designated for breeding with white men, as mixed-race slaves commanded higher prices in the market.
These laws, however, did nothing to prevent interracial relations, especially among white men who felt it was their right to exploit their black female slaves. This led to generations of people with racially mixed heritage. They were commonly referred to as mulatto. This term, derived from the Portuguese and Spanish words for young mule, conveys not only the contempt held toward these individuals, but also the historical misunderstanding of race.
As we know, a mule is the product of a horse and a donkey. It represents a hybrid between two distinct species, and hybrids are inherently sterile. By labeling children born of interracial unions as mulattoes, society affirmed the whites' belief that blacks were not the same species as them and were some sort of subhuman being. Since it was believed that blacks were a different species, they also thought that any offspring from mixed race unions would be sterile or worthless. However, individuals of mixed race heritage were certainly not sterile.
So what does this one-drop rule have to do with black and native relations?
Good question. Prior to European contact, indigenous groups across North America engaged in practices of forced labor and captivity. However, unlike the permanent generational enslavement that arose with British colonization, these forms of bondage were not hereditary or lifelong. However, as Euro-Americans increasingly participated in the transatlantic slave trade, the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations adopted a similar system of inheritable, race-based slavery alongside the racial hierarchy that supported it.
A minority of tribal members owned a significant number of enslaved individuals, generating considerable wealth through their agricultural labor. Conversely, most tribal citizens either owned a few slaves or none at all, mirroring patterns seen in the adjacent United States. The Civil War ultimately led to divisions within these tribes.
During the Civil War, Native tribes were split over their allegiance, with some members fighting on the Confederate side, while others fought on the Union side. Even though it was primarily the slaveholding factions within the tribes that had supported the Confederacy, the U.S. government saw this as an opportunity to compel them to ratify new treaties. The Treaties of 1866 functioned as both a formal surrender for the five tribes as well as a blueprint for the reorganization of their nations in the post-war period.
The stipulations of the treaties included the transfer of land to the United States and required the emancipation and granting of citizenship to the enslaved African Americans within each Native American nation. However, the Chickasaws outright refused to acknowledge their former slaves as citizens, while the Choctaws did so only reluctantly. But in the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations, these black former slaves or freed people received and exercised the right to vote. Though they faced some prejudice, they were largely accepted as tribal members with the rights inherent to this status.
Then in 1877, the Dawes Act was introduced. The Dawes Act was named after Senator Henry Dawes, who was a Republican from Massachusetts. The act was designed as a way to assimilate Native Americans while cleverly taking over their tribal lands. In exchange for U.S. citizenship, the act called for the end of tribal governments and authorized the president to break up reservation land into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals. Essentially, it would convert the native tribes' traditional systems of land tenure held in common into a government-imposed system of private property, essentially forcing Native Americans to assume a capitalist and proprietary relationship with property that did not previously exist in their cultures.
However, before private property could be dispensed, the government had to determine eligibility for the land allotments. This led to the creation of the Dawes Rolls, which was a way to categorize Native Americans by their blood quantum, or as freedmen. The United States government created two distinct rolls. The freedmen roll was established for the formerly enslaved, and the blood roll for Native Americans, who were those individuals who had Native ancestry, as defined by the U.S. government. These two rolls conferred distinctly different rights.
The Dawes system was deeply flawed, and it created a false binary between freedmen and blood citizens that stemmed from the one-drop rule, resulting in members being placed on rolls based on how they looked, sometimes even classifying full-blooded Native Americans as black. Of course, classifying Native people by the way they looked was arbitrary, because in the case of white people, they were automatically placed on the blood rolls based on their word in regards to how much white or Native ancestry they had, thereby creating a system that was rife with fraud.
And effectively, this hindered tribal membership for many people on the freedmen roll. Even if they and their ancestors had possessed Native ancestry, there was no official record of it.
Notably, the Cherokee freedmen had the most difficulty in establishing citizenship in the beginning within the tribe. Their status as citizens was initially based on the Kern-Clifton Rolls, which was a precursor to the Dawes Rolls. The Kern-Clifton Rolls determined that citizenship would be based on whether the freedmen had been in the Cherokee Nation within 6 months of the Civil War. Well, since many freedmen had left Indian Territory during this period, they were unable to gain the same civil and political rights under the Severalty Acts as those who were on the tribal rolls.
Further complicating the recognition of Native ancestry for blacks was the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. In 1890, the Louisiana State Legislature passed a law called the Separate Car Act, which required separate accommodations for blacks and whites on Louisiana railroads. The law required passenger train officers to assign each passenger to the coach or compartment based on race. It also made it a misdemeanor for any passenger to insist on going into a coach or compartment to which by race he does not belong, punishable by either a $25 fine or up to 20 days in prison.
A group of well-known New Orleans citizens from diverse racial backgrounds formed the Comité des Citoyens, also known as the Committee of Citizens. It was a civil rights organization. One of the group's goals was to have the Separate Car Act repealed. The committee convinced Homer Plessy, a man who had 7/8 white and 1/8 black ancestry, to take part in a staged protest to challenge the act.
On June 7, 1892, Plessy walked into the Press Street Depot in New Orleans, bought a first-class ticket to Covington and boarded the East Louisiana Railroad's number 8 train, sitting in a car reserved for whites. The conductor had been informed of Plessy's heritage and asked Plessy to move to the appropriate car, which Plessy refused to do. Plessy told the trainmen that he was an American citizen, that he paid for a first-class ticket, and that he intended to ride in the first-class car. The conductor stopped the train, had Plessy arrested and removed.
In May 1896, the Supreme Court issued a 7-1 decision against Plessy, ruling that Louisiana law did not violate the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The court stated that although the 14th Amendment established legal equality of whites and blacks, it did not and could not require the elimination of all distinctions based upon color.
Plessy's lawyers argued that the Louisiana law inherently implied that black people were inferior and that the states should not be given the inherent power to police themselves. However, the court rejected these arguments and held that a law that classified and separated people by their race was a reasonable and good faith exercise of states' police power and was not designed to oppress a particular class.
Furthermore, the courts held that Louisiana's application of the one-drop rule, that is, anyone with 1 drop of black blood was classified as black under the Louisiana Code, did not violate the 14th Amendment. This case not only gave the states the power to determine the reasonableness of the laws they passed, essentially policing themselves, but it also solidified the notion surrounding the definitions of race, in that no matter how white you appear,
or how Native American you appear,
1 drop of black blood makes you black.
So given that many Native American tribes were facing their own struggles and fearing backlash from the white government, they went along with the Dawes Roll, even though in some cases, members of the same family ended up on different rolls.
By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Creek, Seminole, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Cherokee nations extended citizenship under U.S. government-induced treaties to both those on the freedmen and blood rolls. However, prior to colonization, the idea of determining belonging by degree of blood was mostly unheard of among Native nations. Most Native American tribes did not use blood quantum laws until the U.S. government introduced the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Instead of determining tribal status based on kinship, lineage, and family ties, the blood quantum laws, or Indian blood laws, were enacted in the United States that governed Native American status by fractions of Native ancestry. And also it was a way to establish and legally define racial population groups.
However, many land cession treaties, particularly during Indian removal in the 19th century, contained provisions for mixed blood descendants of European and Native ancestry to receive either parcels of land ceded in the treaty or a share in the lump sum of money. These whites only had to specify as to the degree of their tribal ancestry to qualify, whereas officials used the 1 drop rule to determine qualification for claimant with black ancestry, thereby making it nearly impossible for Native American communities to legally claim blacks as members of the tribes, and those with African ancestry were left off any land or monetary settlements.
So let's fast forward to 1979. The Mucogee, also known as the Creek tribe, changed their constitution to define citizenship by blood. As a result, Black Creeks and their descendants, known as the Freedmen, were effectively expelled. In September 2023, 2 Black descendants of Freedmen, Rhonda Grayson and Jeff Kennedy, sued the Creek Nation for denying their applications. District Judge Danette Mouser reversed the board's decision and ordered it to reconsider the applications in accordance with the tribe's treaty of 1866, which provides that the descendants of those listed on the Creek Freeman roll are eligible for tribal citizenship. The Mucogee Nation, however, argues that sovereignty allows tribes to make their own decisions about who qualifies for citizenship.
In 2021, the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court removed the phrase "by blood" from its constitution and other tribal laws. That change formally acknowledges that the descendants of Black people, once enslaved by the tribe, as well as those who have Cherokee ancestry, but due to the one-drop rule were placed on the freedmen rolls, should now have the right to tribal citizenship. This means that not only will the Black members of the Cherokee Nation enjoy the cultural benefits, but are also eligible to run for tribal office and access resources such as tribal health care.
This 2021 decision by the Cherokee Nation Supreme Court came in response to a 2017 ruling by a U.S. District Court which determined that the descendants of the Cherokee freedmen are entitled to full tribal citizenship under the treaty that the Cherokee Nation made with the U.S. in 1866.
The evolution of the one-drop rule is a complex and multifaceted topic, spanning centuries and influenced by a range of factors, including colonialism, slavery, and governmental policies. Created to maintain white supremacy, this rule has resulted in a deeply flawed social system that has had a far-reaching impact on racial divisions between African American and Native Americans. It's crucial that the Black and Native communities work toward an understanding of race, identity, community belonging, and cultural preservation that acknowledges the diverse and complex history they share. It's time to come together and turn this shared past into future hope and a common fight for the oppressed.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it with your community, like it, and subscribe. If you have any historical videos you would like us to cover, please put it in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
Until next time, adventure seekers, be true to yourselves, patient with each other, keep your mind sharp, and be the change you want to see in the world. Peace.